Economists think there's never a free lunch, meaning there's never a way to get something better than what you have that doesn't involve a trade-off. There is a free lunch here. You can reduce work time without loss of productivity.
Welcome to the PolicyNet podcast by the UNESCO Inclusive Policy Lab. This is a place where top thinkers come to talk data and solutions that reset us along a more fair and smart path. Today, welcome back Juliet Shore. She is a professor at Boston College and a best-selling author. She is also a world-leading figure in work and work time redesign. We first spoke to Juliet in 2023 in a widely popular episode. She now returns with new insights from her recent book entitled 4 Days a Week, a book that advocates for cutting the work week from 5 to 4 days with no pay cuts. We begin by discussing historical precedents. It's not the first time we reduced the work week, so what can we learn from the past?
Is almost an eerie similarity to what happened with the movement to a 5-day week. It was also starting with small businesses, which said that you can do it if you get all your work done. And then it started spreading. Some bigger employers and the government ended up getting involved. The one difference is the very first innovators had religious motivation.
As with any major policy shift, the 4-day work week needs allies and coalitions. So Juliet tells us who they are.
There's a lot of management initiation, but not only. Unions in general have been very positive. We're starting to see some governments take the initiative. You also find environmental groups advocating for this and women's groups. We're going to hear more from disability advocates.
The 4-day week is bound to have ripple effects across social protection, environment, education, and other sectors.
Childcare and schooling may be the most relevant. One of the questions will be, well, are children on a 4-day week with school? Social protection systems are largely based on pay rather than number of hours. Those should be fairly minor kinds of adjustments.
I'm UNESCO's Yulia Shevchuk and I'm your host here. You're listening to the PolicyNet podcast. Hi, Juliet, and welcome back to the podcast. This is your second time here speaking about the 4-day week, which is the reduction of the work week from 5 to 4 days with no pay cut. We're very happy to have you back.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on again. It's a delight to speak with your audience.
By now, you have trialed this policy in over 245 institutions across the US, Canada, Ireland, UK, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Portugal, Brazil, Germany, and I'm sure I'm forgetting other countries. So in the last episode, you highlighted the positive results for employees and for employers. On the employee side, the trials come with very good and tangible boosts in well-being, greater job and life satisfaction, reduced burnout. And on the side of the companies and employers, the experiments show increased productivity, profitability, and reduced absenteeism and turnover amongst their staff. Could you please tell us, since we last spoke, do your policy trials and data continue to support such findings? And is there anything new your data shows?
The short answer to your question is, what do the new results find? Absolutely consistent with what we had when we last spoke, which was in 2023. So since then, we have added countries. We also have the findings from the government-sponsored trials in Portugal and Scotland. We have the Brazilian data's come in and the German data, big German trial. And we are finding absolute consistency we've got those 20 well-being metrics, almost really no changes in what we're seeing. One of the big things that's happened since we spoke is that we've done a lot of pretty sophisticated statistical modeling to try and understand these results. We also added control companies, which we may not have had at the time we spoke last, meaning companies who we are surveying over the same period of time that do not have a 4-day week. So we're looking to have a more robust finding. And what we see in our control companies in Anglophone context, and then also the German and Portuguese trials had control companies as well, is no improvements in those control companies in contrast to the major improvements in the 4-day week. So more confidence that what we are seeing is due to the 4-day week rather than other things that happen to be happening. And given that we now have findings over 3.5 years, we're increasingly confident.
So in your refined modeling, what are the factors and indicators that you measure, and what are the key findings across those?
So what does the modeling show? The first finding is the bigger the work time reduction, the bigger the well-being improvement. Well, all the companies went to a similar work time reduction. Within any company, people have some discretion about, whether they take all that time off or they might actually work that on their off day and so forth. And so what we find is that for people who take the full 8 hours, the well-being improvement is twice what it is for people who are in that 1 to 4 hour category. So that's number one. Number two is why. We're asking why, what is it about shorter hours that improves well-being so much? And there turn out to be two main categories of factors, one of which is what you would expect. People exercise more, they sleep better, they have less fatigue. That's really key. But the second one is the somewhat unexpected, which is we find a big productivity boost on the 4-day week. Now, we are using self-reported productivity, but it's really consistent across multiple productivity measures, including some, fairly detailed or subtle ones like a smart working scale, which is not asking directly about productivity, but asking about aspects of work. That's the mediator through work time reduction. So when people work less, they work smarter and better. And being more on top of their workload also contributes a big boost to their well-being. So the workplace experience as well as the out of workplace. We also developed a model of what leads to success or failure with the 4-day week. And we define success as staying on the 4-day week for at least a year. Failure is what we call a rare event. So there really aren't that many failure cases. We get data from companies. We've been surveying them on an ongoing basis, really up to 24 months. And 90% of the companies are still on the 4-day week after 1 year. So it's a really high level of success. But none of the things that you think might cause failure turn out to cause failure. So the industry doesn't matter. The country doesn't matter. The time period doesn't matter. The size of the company doesn't matter. Whether they're remote, in person, or hybrid doesn't matter. Profit, nonprofit doesn't matter. What does matter? And these results aren't too strong because mostly every kind of company and every kind of outcome is associated with success that we've been able to model. So number one, if the company doesn't get the well-being results, there are a few companies which don't see it. And normally it has to do with the way it's implemented. Either they didn't give it to everyone or they didn't really do the work beforehand to make it work. There are 2 months of work reorganization before the companies go to a 4-day week. And they need to do that to figure out how to do this without losing a lot of productivity or output. And not all of them do. Some of them just tell people, figure it out yourself. That doesn't work. The other thing is, and we don't, we can speculate about why this is, companies which have more white men in their labor forces do worse. So that is the strongest predicting variable. They have the hardest time getting out of what's called the, workaholic culture, or in some of the sociological literature, it's called masculinity contests. But that kind of association of masculinity and long hours of work makes it a little bit harder. And then the final thing I would say, this is less about a finding and more just about what's going on. We're seeing more health and social service organizations coming into 4-day weeks. And then we've also had some really important political developments in a wide range of countries pushing this agenda forward.
That's a good update, and I do encourage the listeners to listen to the first episode because we've discussed and debated the concept, the pro and cons, the positive, the negative, the kinds of industries that you have tested the concept in, the size of companies. So that's all relevant. But in this episode, we want to discuss new and different questions. So before I go into the nitty-gritties of the trials more, I'd like you to talk about the historical similarities, because the concept is new to us, but you say in your book that it has been done in the sense that there was a 6-day work week and it has been reduced to 5 days, and now you are advocating for further reduction. So what are the similarities and what are the differences? What do you think that path could teach us in terms of harnessing the political support, making the economic case and argument for the 4-day week?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote a book about work time 35 years ago called The Overworked American, but I really started that book at the post-war period. So one of the things I did for this one was to go back and look at what happened in the pre-war period when we went from 6 to 5 days. And I focused on the US, which was the first country to do that. So what I found is almost an eerie similarity to what happened with the movement to a 5-day week to what I was seeing today. So the first thing is that it was originally an employer-driven innovation. The one difference is in the shift to 5, the very first innovators had religious motivation. There were a group of Orthodox Jewish rabbis who saw the Jewish Sabbath, which is Saturday, becoming less relevant, and some of their more reform colleagues were advocating to go to a Christian Sabbath, i.e. Sunday. So they wanted to push back against that. So they began agitating against Saturday work. And then a group of garment factory owners, a lot of them were Jewish, decided to follow the rabbis and began a 5-day week. So no Saturday work. And then it started spreading to other trades. It was also starting with small businesses, which is what we are seeing. Small and medium enterprises are by far the ones leading this. And some of the other things were really similar. So, for example, a lot of the companies reported either no change or increases in productivity when they went from 6 to 5. And many of them were on half days. So it was maybe a little bit less to make up. But we also have that today. Like a lot of Friday afternoons in a lot of companies are, kind of a low activity period. The other thing was there was a group of them which said that you can do it if you get all your work done. A lot of the companies in our trials are taking that stance. And in garment work, they were paid by the piece, the workers. So they were able to sort of work faster to make their quotas by Friday. Then what we see is you start to get some bigger employers starting this. And, we've seen some bigger manufacturers. That was Henry Ford was the first one, Ford Motor Company. They announced in 1922. They went in 1926. Lamborghini, bigger German companies we've seen. And then the government ended up getting involved. And that's kind of the way I see it happening. And it took place over a couple of decades. I mean, the rabbis started agitating in the 1900s. So as I say in the book, it's a kind of uncanny, a little bit of a deja vu.
Well, you say that the first time around religious circles were pushing for it. Who are your allies now? Who is advocating and pushing for the 4-day week? And just out of interest, are the unions on the side of the experiment? Do they have concerns maybe with such drastic redesign?
Yes. In the earlier case, the unions were initially skeptical because they thought it would entail reductions in wages. But they started to come around, and then in the 1920s, you got a couple of national contracts that put the 5-day week in. And so unions in general have been very positive about this. In fact, the very first trial we did, which was started in Ireland at the beginning of 2022, the initial impetus for it came from the largest union in Ireland, which is the public sector union, Forsa. In 2023, the UAW, United Auto Workers Union, staged a historic strike, which they won in the U.S., and they put 32 hours into their bargaining demands. And a number of German unions have done that as well. They didn't win that time, but my understanding is they are planning to make the 32-hour week one of their big demands in their next contract, which will be 2028. I think they'll be bargaining. So in general, unions have been positive. They weren't there at the very beginning, as in the 5-day week story, but more and more they've been coming into play in the United States. In Europe, they've been a little more present, I would say, from the beginning. And then other allies. So it's interesting. This movement that I've been studying sort of had its impetus from management. The NGO that organized the trials originally was founded by a businessman in Australia who had a financial services company and tried this and had a really great experience with it and wanted to spread the word. So there's a lot of management initiation, but not only. I mean, I've talked to people in companies where the union suggested it, some of the small companies, or we're starting to see some governments take the initiative. Since we last spoke, the city government of Tokyo put all its employees on a 4-day week, in part because they're hoping that women will have more babies. They have a fertility crisis, and they think long hours of work is contributing to that. So there is also that government interest. That the first trial ever announced was from the government of Spain, which announced a 4-day week trial while we were still in the COVID period, a 3-year trial in which they were going to pay that 5th days of wages for companies with a declining share of that over the 3 years. So you also find environmental groups advocating for this and women's groups. One group that I think we're going to hear more from because of the kinds of findings that we have is people who advocate for those with disabilities, because a 4-day week makes it easier for people to stay in the labor force with certain kinds of disabilities. And we are seeing that showing up. People talking about that in our comments and interviews.
So you have your allies, and indeed, after we spoke last time, people kept sending us articles and news items about the trials. And I think a month after we spoke, the French government announced their trials in the public sector. I want to talk about so many things, and you mentioned women, you mentioned the environment, and it's a very, very important topics. But since we've been speaking about bigger things, I'd like to stay a bit at that level and talk about systems in general. So such a shift would have ripple effects and long-term impact. I think about social protection systems. I'm thinking about childcare and schooling, systems that need to be reformed. It's not that it cannot be done, but it does take creative thinking and willingness to rethink. So what is your take on that? What systems will be affected by such a shift, and what should the governments and the companies willing to adopt be looking at?
Yeah. So I would say on the social protection side, really not much has to be done, because this doesn't affect the sort of, you just think of it as a change in the standard work week. The pay is not changing in any of these companies. So everyone's getting their same pay. So to the extent that social protection systems are largely based on pay rather than number of hours, I think those should be, fairly minor kinds of adjustments. So that's the first thing. But I think that the childcare issue and schooling may be the one that's maybe the most relevant. We're seeing a mix of things in terms of what's going on with our people, with our parents. So one of the things we see is that men are doing more childcare and housework, which is a good thing. But some of our people are saving on childcare costs because they are taking care of their children on their off day. And for some of them, it's financial. For some of them, it's just they wanted more time to spend with their children. So it's a positive in both cases. In other cases where people have childcare or their children are in school, and this would be the majority, people are using that day for themselves, for self-care, because a lot of what's creating the momentum for this movement is the fact that so many people report not having adequate time for self-care. This idea, I have a chapter called 2 days is not enough. And that's a sentiment we hear a lot. I mean, particularly where you have a lot of dual earner families or single-headed families, those 2 days on the weekend are not enough to do all the things that you have to do to maintain a household and maintain your life and life admin and also to have a life outside of work. So people spend that day for socializing, a lot of hobbies, self-grooming, doing errands, etc. So if everybody is on a 4-day week, one of the questions will be, well, are children on a 4-day week with school? Personally, I could see the benefits of that because I think children have been stressed out too, just like workers. On the other hand, having care for parents for that day off is really a benefit. So what I think we would need there is flexibility for households to figure out which of those options is the one that really is best for them.
So you mentioned the environment before, and that is a big part of this conversation because the 4-day work week is expected to have positive environmental impact, especially in terms of reducing the commuting emissions and lowering office energy use. So what do your experiments show, especially now that you have control companies?
Well, let's start with the commuting. Because so many companies went to work from home, and we have predominantly white-collar companies. We do have some construction, we have healthcare, we have restaurants, but the vast majority are white-collar. We have manufacturing too, but these are smaller numbers. So most of those commuting benefits have been wiped out by work from home. We see a little bit of a commuting benefit. People doing less commuting, less likely to commute by car, and less time spent in commuting, so that there'll be a little carbon benefit there. But so much of the time of our trials, people were moving back into the office, into these hybrid schedules, so we didn't see that bigger commuting impact that you would if you were going from 5 days at work to 4, where you would expect probably about a 14%. It's not a full 20% is what the prior studies show. You might get about a 14-15% reduction in commuting emissions. Okay, I don't think there's really too much of a building differential for a couple of reasons. One is that you have more energy use in households when people are at home, so that balances out some of it. You also have many businesses which are going to stay open for 5 days, but they won't have their whole labor force there, but they're going to heat and cool their entire premises. We tried to look at that, and we just couldn't get enough data from the companies, and it was just too messy. I mean, a key thing here is there's no income reduction with these trials. So people's spending patterns really haven't changed that much. And then the other thing that we worried about was a rebound effect on travel. So are people jetting off on cheap flights, or are they traveling more? And what we are finding is basically no travel rebound. So that's a very positive thing. So our original surveying had, a series of questions. We weren't able to dig deep enough into the environmental questions, in part because it's a very long survey to begin with. So we developed a smaller deep dive project into the carbon impacts, where we started with interviews of people on the 4-day week. And what we found was mostly not too much change in their carbon intense use. And based on the interviews, we developed a survey, and the smaller survey, which has many more items, is finding pretty much what the interviews did, which is really not too much change.
So what is there to be done to boost the environmental benefit of the 4-day week? And is there indeed a concrete way to boost those benefits?
There are two pieces to it. One is reducing commuting. And so it depends on whether people are in the office or the factory. So we have 25% fully remote in our sample. As we move to more and more kinds of companies, you're going to see those benefits there. But the other thing is there's no trade-off of income for time. And sort of over the long run, you expect that there's going to be some, if you keep reducing working hours, not just a one time from a 5 to a 4-day, you will get more carbon benefits because you will be taking some of the productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work. And that's what all of, the macro modeling that I've done, as well as that of many other people, shows that association.
So moving from environment to another hot topic, and that is the technological change, and so much talk about AI and its impact on labor displacement, productivity gains, and more recently on reinstatement effect. And Darren Asimoglu, who's in writing and talking about this and a guest on our podcast, has been underlying that issue. You are calling for greater attention to the relationship between technology and working hours. So in what ways those interact, and what is your take on that?
So I have a chapter in the book on AI. What I do in that chapter is, first of all, I look at the first industrial revolution, because that was a technological change on the par maybe with what we're going to see with AI, which is a massive new labor-saving technology coming in. And what happened there was, first, you get a big increase in working hours. In part, these are expensive machines, and the companies put them in, the employers, and they want to use them all the time. And they keep people at work for long hours. And then eventually working hours start to come down because workers press for that. And that starts in the last quarter of the 19th century in the early industrializing countries. The work of Daron Acemoglu and his colleagues casts doubt on the standard economist view about labor-saving technical change, which is not to worry about unemployment because everybody will be reemployed in other places and new tasks and new jobs, and the productivity growth is going to make that happen. And I've always been somewhat skeptical of that view, in part because I think economists never recognized how much work time reduction was key to understanding why we didn't get mass unemployment from the first industrial revolution. Why? They just don't think about hours of work. They think about jobs because they think hours of work are just fungible across people, and there isn't. I mean, one of the big arguments of the overworked American was that there isn't a perfect competitive market in hours like their model assumed. And so you get that fixity, you get downward rigidity on hours. The market won't reduce hours. You've got to have interventions because employers don't like hours reductions. Where I'm with Acemoglu, I'm totally with him on the concern about the labor displacing aspects and the question which animates so much of his work, which many of us are asking, which is who's going to benefit from AI? Are the owners of these technologies going to be able to capture all the value, in which case chances are they're going to reduce their workforces and lay off a lot of people? Or are workers going to benefit, in which case you would most likely get hours reductions? And you have a lot of important business people, like, and I mentioned them, Bill Gates and Jamie Dimon and Steve Cohen. They're actually talking about a 3.5-day work week as a result of AI. And I think it's what's really, really key. We really have to couple it with work time reduction so that we don't end up with just laying off masses of people. I'll say one other thing, because we're now deep diving into AI and we have a little bit of data on AI use at our firms, and we're going to be doing more on that. And what it seems to be the case from survey data and so forth is that you're seeing less employee resistance and better AI deployment at the 4-day week firms. And it makes a lot of sense because people in those firms are not worried about losing their jobs. They know that their employers are committed to them because they just put in this wonderful miracle kind of innovation, which is so devoted to well-being. And there's more pressure to save time. So there's some surveying which says that employers who are more open to 4-day weeks have higher levels of proficiency with the use of AI already.
Thank you, Juliette. We spoke a lot about the positive outcomes of the 4-day week. Are there negative impacts or risks that you think companies and governments, as they scale up and adopt the 4-day week, should be aware of and inbuilt into their thinking and planning and implementation?
Yeah, it's such an important question. So we tried to anticipate some of the blowback or rebound negative effects that we might see. So one was work intensity. Is this just a speed up? This is such a fascinating part of our findings. There's a very, very small increase in intensity of work, but really quite minimal in comparison to all the other changes. So it's not primarily a speed up. They are primarily figuring out ways to work more efficiently and waste less time and do things differently. We were worried about second job holding. We actually see a slight reduction, very small, but reduction in second job holding. Overtime hours, no increase in overtime hours. Workplace sociability. This is something that people worried about. No change in workplace sociability. Are people less creative because they're more pressed for time? We have a creativity scale. We're not seeing that. I mean, I think the only place where you sort of see problems is where the companies don't adequately prepare. I think where I see the potential for more problems, number one, is does this just become something that higher paid, more privileged, white collar, higher educated workers get? I mean, we only have about a quarter of our sample without a college education. Or does it come in some sectors and not others? And I think that's where the government is so key, because once you get these early adopters and the people who they see that it's going to work for them, but what about all the other companies that, can't envision that it could be a success? Eventually, it's going to have to be government one way or the other that's going to pull them along. But I do think the government is much more attuned to the idea that this should be something for everyone. And that's part of why they're giving, in many of the bills that are being proposed in the United States, for example, for trials, they are giving tax incentives to the businesses, or where you have local governments doing it, they're doing it for everybody, regardless of where they sit on the occupational ladder.
Indeed, we spoke a lot about scale up in the last episode, saying that the path to replication and at scale adoption lies through the government. So given that government is such a big part of the equation, if you are to distill several key recommendations to the policymakers, to the decision makers, when they're thinking about reduction of working hours and 4-day week, what specifically they should be paying attention to? What are the key arguments they should be taking in consideration? And again, the risks they should be accounting for?
Think that the governments need to put some money into running trials with robust research. We don't have randomized control trials. We have controls, but there's no way we could get randomization because we have no leverage over companies. A lot of these economists have said, oh, why didn't you do an RCT? And it's like, think about it for a minute. Number one, these are organization-wide. It's not like a drug where people are desperate to get the drug, and so they'll enroll in the trial knowing that, they have a 50% chance of not getting it. If companies enroll in our trial and then we say, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you do that, we have no leverage over them. They could just do it whatever they want. So you need an entity that has a really big carrot, a huge incentive to get a true random. The other issue about the randomization is it'll never be a truly random unless the government forces companies into it, which they're not going to do, because all these trials involve a selection bias. But it would be better for all the companies that select into it if you could randomize them, or if you have big enough companies where you can do it in some part of the company and not others. But we didn't have big enough companies generally for that. That also undermines the trial a little bit, because one of the things we're really focusing on is how doing it for the whole organization matters. We've done a lot of research already. There's a lot of evidence that this can work, and not just from my own team, but, plenty of other companies that have done it on their own and so forth. So I think getting the incentives for the ones who have less imagination about how it could work. I mean, that's really, really key for government. We talked about government, but since we spoke before, the unions are stepping up more. So that's another, you can get a lot of momentum if you get some big union contracts that start to do this. And that, can work synergistically with government.
Now, can I play devil's advocate and be it policymakers or anyone thinking about the idea, why would they adopt it? There is so much disruption already going on. It's so hard to govern all of them. with less and less resources, especially human resources, and the capacities of governments to reinvent and rethink systems and adapt to new challenges and reshape the policies to match these challenges, why would they actually want to scale up and adopt such a disruptive, at the end of the day, policy? Or maybe it's not disruptive, but
I don't think it's a very disruptive policy. I mean, that's in a way the beauty of it, one piece of the beauty of it, which is it stops the disruption in a sense. I mean, if you said, why would employers want to do it? And you asked, why would government? So let me start with the employers. For the employers, the main drivers are, number one, the lack of well-being in their workforces. If you look at data about state of the workforce around the world, so let's take the Gallup, they do that annual report. Stress, burnout, all of those disengagement, all those negative indicators soared during the pandemic, and they started to come down, but then they've stopped and they have stabilized at a very high level. So you're seeing high levels of stress, of disengagement, of workers struggling, and low levels. And I'm talking about, half the labor force around the world saying they experience stress a lot of the day, the previous day, not too far off the peaks from the pandemic. And so that progress from the height of the pandemic really has stopped. That's not good for employers. It's not good for the quality of the services and the products, and then it leads to not just burnout, but also attrition, people leaving, and you have labor shortages in various places. And one of the things that these 4-day week firms will tell you is that when they advertise a job, they get huge numbers of applicants. A 4-day week person was just talking to me about getting 1,000 applicants for one job because they have such a competitive advantage. Now, of course, that won't last as it scales, but for now, for employers, it's huge. And then I had already mentioned this, but if you are an employer who pays on the low end in wages, this can absolutely eliminate that disadvantage for you. So lots of reasons for the companies, because they're not suffering. There's no downside to it. They're not losing productivity for the most part, etc. I think for governments, you get a healthier population and you have a whole range of social costs that you're not still subjected to. So better health, mental and physical, for your population. Fewer highly trained professionals burning out and leaving their fields. The government paid so much for those expensive educations for nurses and doctors and so forth. The environmental benefits that you get if you really scale it throughout. Let me put it this way, and I talk about this a lot in my book. Economists think there's never a free lunch, meaning there's never a way to get something better than what you have that doesn't involve, a trade-off. Their assumption is that we are always at the frontier where doing one thing involves a trade-off. And what our research is showing is that there is a quote unquote free lunch here, which is that you can reduce work time without loss of productivity. And it's really hard for economists to believe that. They are genetically, it's just in their bones. It doesn't make sense to them. But as an economist myself, what I would say is just, that it's not true that every firm is on the productivity frontier. There's lots of strong evidence about that. There's always a range, which means that there are at least some of those firms that actually could do this because they are not as efficient as they could be. And that's really key. I call it the forcing function of the 4-day week, which is that you have plenty of firms out there where they just haven't yet been forced to become more efficient. And the 4-day week allows them to do that because it gives the incentive to the employees as well as to the employers.
Well, I think we reached the end of the questions. It has been very interesting and helpful. Juliette, thank you for coming on the podcast. And we do hope to see you come back for a third episode.
Yes, absolutely.
We reached the end of this episode. For more deep debate and data-driven solutions, follow the PolicyNet podcast.